Today we're taking a look at the Fujifilm X-S20. As we can see here, that one has a nice lens on there. Everyone will recognize this lens. This is the iconic Fujifilm 18-55 f2.8 kit lens, which has went down in history as possibly one of the best kit lenses ever created. But let's take that lens away and take a look at this camera, because that's what we're talking about today. As you can see here, we've got an APS-C size sensor, as we get from a lot of Fujifilm cameras, majority of the ones that we sell also. What we get in here is a previous generation sensor. We're getting a CMOS 4, so it's the X-Trans 4 sensor inside of this thing, 26 megapixels inside of that, but what we are getting is a new processor, and we're getting an X processor 5 within inside this camera, which allows it to have an advantage over the previous generation in terms of how it can record and how it can store files and things like that. So let's take a quick look around the body so we can get familiar with this thing in a little bit more detail. So the Fujifilm X-S20 is a little bit of a hybrid between, say, an X-T5 and an X-H2. Let me explain. If you take a look at the body style itself, it does have a frontal look of an X-T5. We have an X-T5 here right now. So they look pretty similar. But then if you look closely, the actual grip on this thing is quite a bit deeper, which is not how it is on the X-T5. A lot more shallow. So yeah, we're getting a little bit of a different, slightly changed body. Obviously we're not getting any top screen on here like we get on the XH series, but we are getting some of the dials that we get from the XT. So it's definitely a blend between the two, and I think exactly this makes sense for the position that Fujifilm has placed this camera in. It's definitely a hybrid camera, specifically made for those that are maybe creating content online. So let's take a look over this camera, all its buttons and dials, and see what we get here. So first button to have a look at is this release button at the front here, which obviously releases our lens here, and we have a scroll wheel to the left. There's no custom buttons on the front. There's also no toggle switch down here, which we're used to for the continuous single-use shutter and manual, for controlling focus. So that's done away with on this camera. Let's take a look at the side here. You notice there is a microphone port here at the top, which is kind of uniquely placed. It's not kind of inside the flaps, it's just sitting on the outside. And then when we do open the doorways, we have there a USB-C, which is also used for charging as well, and a micro HDMI. There is no other ports here. As we continue to rotate round, we can see that the body structure continues with that nice finish there. And then we have a fully articulating screen on this camera here, which is one of those things that we're becoming accustomed to. This one definitely needs a clean, look at that. But yeah, articulating screens are very handy for video users and things like that. Some people find them a little bit scary because they're intimidated by the fact that they might snap away. Other users are used to the previous short articulation screens that you find on XT5s. Everyone has a different preference, but I definitely think for video users, having an articulating screen, being able to see yourself, for instance, and getting all those crazy angles, below angles, above angles, and stuff like that, they're quite important to video users, so it makes a lot of sense. You'll notice here as well, when we take a look at the back of the camera, we've got the two same ports that we had on the XH2 series. Let's take a look a little bit closer here. And once again, those are allowing us to attach a fan that goes onto the back of the camera, so to prevent overheating. Okay, so we can close this one up, and now let's take a look at the back of this camera. So as we're looking at the back of the camera, there's also a lot of dials that are kind of not on here anymore. So we don't have the AEL button, which we're kind of accustomed to with a lot of Fuji cameras, and we've kind of done away with the pad here, the up, down, left, right pad, which we normally select. So a lot of those functionalities have been put straight into the joystick here and controlled that way. We've still got the menu button, we've got the display button there, but everything else is kind of minimalized. So it's kind of a step into the Fujifilm world and not thrown into it. To the left, we still have a rubbish bin there, or a trash can. We have our playback button, and the AEL now is at the top here, and then the AF on is there as well. Let's take a look at the top of the camera here now. And as we can see, it's kept it quite simple for us. We've got our scroll wheel here. We've got our Q button, our ISO button. We've got our on and off toggle switch here, our record button to the right there. Everything feels quite familiar right now. And then we've got another scroll wheel at the top here. We've got our hot shoot there, and then over the top here we have another dial which is also for custom control that you can set up inside this camera. And then we have one more little toggle switch, which is this one just here, if I can get that one in focus for you guys. And that one allows us to have a flash pop up for us. So let's demonstrate that flash right now. That's pretty cool. There you go. Hides away pretty nicely. So let's talk about some of the specs that we are getting with this camera. What are the improvements? What is so nice about this camera? So getting a 26 megapixel sensor. It's running through the X Processor 5 system. We're now getting 14-bit raw photography out of this thing, whereas we're getting 12-bit on the previous generations. It's got internal IBIS, so it's got image stabilization on the sensor. As we wobble that, you may or may not be able to see it, but that can correct your stabilization up to 7 stops. We're getting 30 frames per second on continuous high shooting. That is on the electronic shutter, and it will crop in 1.25 times on the image. If you want to shoot mechanically, you're getting 8 frames per second, so still pretty fast, but not as shockingly fast as the 30 frames per second you're getting from the electronic shutter. When you are recording audio, we're actually recording into 24-bit now, which is quite a high bit rate, which means that you're not going to clip your audio as easily as you would have with previous generations. It's also recording that in stereo audio if you are recording using the onboard microphones. And for recording video now, we can record up to 6.2K, which is quite crazy. It's a very high resolution there, and that's recording it at a high bit rate as well at 360 megabits per second. You can also do F-Log, and the dynamic range of this camera is safe up to 13 stops of dynamic range, which is fairly high. That's quite high for a small camera like this. It's put it definitely into the professional realm when it comes to the video on this camera. And of course, we have film simulations on this camera. This camera has 19 film simulations, so let's take a look at which ones we get inside this one. We have our Provia, which we're used to, Velvia, Astia, Classic Chrome, Pro Negative High, Pro Negative Standard, Classic Neg, it's one of the newer ones, Nostalgic Neg also, Eterna Cinema, Eterna Bleach Bypass, Acros, Monochrome, and Sepia, whatever. So we're getting all kind of the newer ones inside of this camera. So everything that we're kind of expecting from the latest generation of Fujifilm cameras, we're getting that inside this camera, even though it's still running off the previous sensor type, the X-Trans 4 sensor. One last thing to touch upon about this camera, although it is built very nicely, it is still not a weather resistant body on this one like you will be getting from the X-T5, you will be getting from the XH2 series. So bear that in mind if you're buying this. Maybe don't take it out into extensive environments. But I hope you enjoyed that quick overview of this camera, which I think will be a nice jump for content creators. Okay.